This is one of a series of good answers presentations, offering evidence to answer skeptical challenges to the Bible's accuracy. This talk, however, is unique in the series. It explores the author's own search for truth and for personal peace over much of a lifetime. It reveals a 30-year struggle with the theory of evolution that nearly destroyed the author's faith. And it shows how the Good Answers ministry came to be. Join me, if you will, on a spiritual journey. But first, who am I anyway? I'm a classicist with some 40 years at the University of Delaware, teaching Greek, Latin, classical literature, and ancient history. A Christian, sure, and I've delivered my share of sermons when there was no professional on the scene. But though I was ordained once upon a time, I'm not serving a church as its minister, nor am I likely ever to take on that role. Nearly everyone has what we call a public face and a private one. We should start, no doubt, with my public face. Then we can get to the other part. For me, it started way back in the midst of America's Great Depression, 1934. I was the fifth kid in my family, and the last. My dad worked for Chrysler as a line foreman, first in Evansville, Indiana, then in Detroit, then back in Evansville. Here he is with our brood. That shirt he's wearing looks odd because it's drawn onto the picture. At home, in summer, he preferred undershirts. A childhood bout of rheumatic fever had damaged my dad's mitral valve, and that eventually killed him at age 37, when I was 2 years old. My mother then held the family together by taking in boarders and doing laundry. But I was loved and cared for, and though we had little to spare, somehow as a kid I didn't feel poor. I got a decent schooling, worked my way through college, spent 2 years in the Army, and then, with the help of the GI Bill, completed graduate school to obtain the first Ph.D. in our family. Classics with historical emphasis, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. That brought me to Delaware, where I taught at UD from 1970 until 1994, my first retirement. It was followed by further retirements in 2000, 2010, and 2011, all from UD. They kept calling me back. Work I did there with computer-based instruction in Latin, Greek, and French led eventually to a foreign language media center, on which they put my name, and I didn't even have to die first. But it wasn't all academics. Along the way, I had acquired a lovely, loyal wife and 3 delightful daughters. And, once retired, Betty and I enjoyed the luxury of travel to places like Hawaii, Ireland, and Greece. Looked at from the outside, then, my life might resemble one of those stories that made Horatio Alger famous back in the day. Local boy, through the dint of honesty, pluck, and hard work, makes good. But all of that's just window dressing. It's the internal journey that matters, and that one was not so upbeat. Let's look under the hood. Along about age 14, I encountered the first turning point of my life, when a visit to a Christian service camp made me face the claim of Christ on me. Though raised in the church, I had not taken the issue of faith personally till then. But that changed at Dixon Springs, Illinois. One beautiful evening, I stepped down into the lake and was baptized into Christ. 3 years later came another major decision, and I was off to Cincinnati Bible Seminary and the prospect of a life in the Christian ministry. Despite the inspiration I found there and the experience of student preaching, I eventually realized that the professional ministry was not God's plan for me. I sensed that He was calling me to serve Him in secular education, and that path led through graduate school at Carolina. But between Cincinnati and Carolina, at a college class in St. Joseph, Missouri, I first met Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species. It was a term project in a history course. I studied that classic work and critiqued it, convincing myself, though not the professor, of course, that it was seriously flawed. Christianity 1, evolution 0. That was where the score stood for a few years. But once I arrived at the University of Delaware, I found the very air was filled with Darwinism. It was just understood that every educated person accepted the tenets of evolution. But I was a Christian. I'd been active in the church and in leadership positions everywhere we had lived for years, and that was not going to change just because of a few doubts. Like a guy trying to find a comfortable position in a lumpy bed, I twisted and turned and pounded the pillow. And then I thought I saw a way out. C.S. Lewis, one of my greatest heroes, found no problem with evolution. He imagined the transition from ape-like creature to man in this way. For long centuries, God perfected the animal form which was to become the vehicle of humanity and the image of himself. Then, in the fullness of time, God caused to descend upon this organism, both on its psychology and physiology, a new kind of consciousness, which could say, I and me, which could look upon itself as an object, which knew God, which could make judgments of truth, beauty, and goodness, and which was so far above time that it could perceive time flowing past. Well, if Lewis could be okay with evolution, surely I could too. Accepting evolution did require me to read the early chapters of Genesis rather creatively. I might then have said intelligently, but I could still teach adult Bible classes, still serve as an elder, and still be the Christian husband and father I so wanted to be. But Darwin didn't leave me alone. The more I thought about the theory, the more convinced I became that its sweep and depth encompassed all of the intellectual landscape. Accept the theory's basic principles, especially as they were refined into neo-Darwinism by the 1950s, and it began to crowd out one's Christian faith. Ultimately, I was forced to conclude these were not just two doctrines. They were two world views. Either we were living in God's world or in a materialistic one. I could no longer find a middle ground. My family. What about them? I might look in the mirror and ask, as I did, does God really exist? And I might answer, as I did, I really don't know. But I had a wife and 3 daughters who looked to me for guidance and support. Betty and I discussed just leaving the church, dumping it all, but we couldn't do that to the kids. If I was wrong, I'd be taking them down the road to perdition. Stay in the church, then. Keep teaching those Bible classes. Keep your doubts to yourself. Mine was a classic dilemma, and as a classicist I recognized it as such. On the one side there was Socrates, whispering in my ear, "The unexamined life is not worth living." After all, I had chosen the academic life, and introspection is a part of one's job description. If I didn't look into the mirror periodically, how could I know who I really was? But on the other side, there was old Julius Caesar, muttering, "Yond Cassius has a lean and hungry look. He thinks too much. Such men are dangerous." Was I just thinking too much? Why not just tell myself that my public face was the real one? Everybody else seemed to think so. Nobody can live that way forever. By now, there were grandchildren in the picture, and still no resolution for my dilemma. Then, in 1993, something unexpected happened. My eldest daughter invited me to a creation conference on the UD campus. Creationism? Come on. I had read some of that creationist literature years before, and found it unimpressive. I didn't want to hear anything I was sure would be anti-intellectual. But I also didn't want to disappoint my daughter, with whom I had had a somewhat strained relationship, so I went. 3 days of lectures, videos, and discussions. It was not convincing, but there was just enough there to force me to a new course of action. After decades of discomfort and doubt, I had to settle the issue. And anyway, I was supposed to be an academic. I knew how to do research. And being all set for an early retirement from UD, I could devote some serious attention to the question that wouldn't seem to leave me alone. Serious attention? I'll say. For the next 5 years, I did next to nothing else. I read whatever I could find on both sides of the controversy. Quite a bit of what the creationists wrote was rather shallow, in my opinion. But on the evolution side, writers usually talked as if their position was just self-evident. I noticed that creationists spent much of their time looking for holes or contradictions in evolutionary theory. But the evolutionists just stated the majority opinion of the scientific community as if that were proof in itself. Majority rules, they seemed to say. I kept digging, and eventually I began to discover some serious scholarship that challenged evolution. Michael Denton, both Ph.D. and M.D., had a powerful book called Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. Michael Behe, molecular biologist, had written Darwin's Black Box. Philip Johnson, a lawyer with special credentials in logic and argument, authored Darwin on Trial, and later, Reason in the Balance. Marvin Lubenow, an anthropologist, exposed how weak was the evidence for ape men in Bones of Contention. Lee Spetner, whose doctorate in physics led him eventually to specialize in information science, wrote Not by Chance. Astronomer Danny Faulkner highlighted problems with the Big Bang. And Russell Humphreys, an astrophysicist with Sandia Labs, showed how Einstein's theories support, believe it or not, a 6-day creation scenario. To help me clarify my own thinking on these issues, I developed an instructional software program that was published as Evolution, Science or Myth. That program, while acknowledging that there are arguments on both sides, eventually shows that I find the evidence against evolution more convincing. One of the key reasons in my own progress toward a creationist perspective has been the character of evolution's proponents. The most prominent spokesmen for Darwinism in recent years have been Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Dawkins. Both are on record as committed atheists, though since his death I rather think Dr. Gould will have changed his view. I doubt there are any atheists among the dead. Dawkins, when being interviewed a few years ago about what in Darwinism he found personally most significant, said that the theory makes it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And this remark, so revealing, highlights a crucial issue in the controversy. The real, and perhaps only reason for evolutionary theory is to make God unnecessary. I was struck, too, by a remark Philip Johnson made. He had noted that the National Center for Science Education, which lobbies for more teaching of evolution in the schools, put out a statement. They wanted to assure parents that evolutionary theory doesn't conflict with the existence of God. That's when Johnson observed, "Apparently the theory has no problem with God existing, so long as existing is all he does." And then C.S. Lewis, despite his early acceptance of Darwinism, eventually came to harbor a growing dislike of it. Not so much of its arguments, he said, but of its advocates. He wrote to Captain Ackworth in 1954, "What inclines me now to think that you may be right in regarding evolution as the central and radical lie in the whole web of falsehood that now governs our lives is not so much your arguments against it as the fanatical and twisted attitudes of its defenders." Seeing that my hero had developed his own doubts about the theory was no small factor in my own struggle. Still, as I pored over the evidence on both sides, I had to admit that there were good arguments for each. But eventually, after 5 years, I got down to the fundamental level, the origin of life. And there came the crunch for me. The more carefully I looked at the evidence, the more I saw that there was no rational way to explain the existence of life apart from a Creator God. And with that realization, all of the doubts began to melt away. A worldview that requires God, in my estimation, simply allows no room for evolutionary theory, especially when Darwinism, properly understood, allows no room for God. We see this when, across the board, the best-known defenders of evolution show their contempt for those who believe in theistic evolution, or progressive creation, or the gap theory, or any theory that combines God with evolution. In their view, these folks just don't get it. They haven't understood Darwin. The whole reason for the theory is to make God not just unnecessary, but irrelevant. And so, I came around. After 30 years of struggling to harmonize my Christian faith with my acceptance of evolution, I concluded that, after all, science, real laboratory science, is on the side of God. And then, there's what has happened since. Dr. Mary Schweitzer at Montana State University cuts open a partly fossilized T-Rex femur, judged to be 68 million years old, and finds it contains hemoglobin, red blood cells, and still flexible connective tissue. Here's a photomicrograph of that tissue. When she gets challenged by colleagues, and she certainly did with that discovery, she spends 2 more years on the issue and publishes findings that no one has been able to disprove. Note this concluding statement of a detailed and balanced analysis, and not by a creationist, incidentally. It's in the high-tech magazine Wired. Asara and Schweitzer, in other words, have done just what the critics asked. They've built a rigorous scientific case for the survival of 68-million-year-old proteins from a beast that animates children's imaginations. The writer still buys into evolution's millions of years, but admits Schweitzer has proved her case anyway. Bottom line, it's unavoidable. T-Rex can't even be 1,000,000 years old. Then, the Institute for Creation Research tries something no one else has ever thought to do, and tests coal, fossils, and diamonds for carbon-14. Of course, with its 5,730-year half-life, C14 effectively disappears after 100,000 years. By then, it has all decayed back to nitrogen-14. So, of course, nobody had ever thought of looking for any remains of it in things believed to be millions of years old. But the radiological labs reported back that there was C14 present in all the samples in easily detectable quantities. Think about that. Every scientist in the world knows that after 100,000 years, there simply can't be any C14 left in anything like bone or coal. But there it was, in all of them. The coal samples, rated at 300 million years old, are less than 100,000 years old. The fossils, believed to be between 60 and 400 million years of age, less than 100,000 years. What's more, all the fossils and coal samples contain essentially the same amount of C14, indicating that the plants and animals from which they came all lived at the same time and died around the same time. And even diamonds, formed deep in the earth and essentially impossible to contaminate, and believed to be almost as old as the planet itself, have these same amounts of C14 in them. These are results from the best radiological labs in the world, obtained in double-blind studies, showing that fossils, coal, and even diamonds cannot even be as much as 100,000 years old. And since then, secular researchers have found the same results, and are scratching their heads over them. After all, the one thing evolution absolutely requires is deep time. As Nobel winner George Wald famously said, "Time is the hero of the plot." Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible, the possible probable, and the probable virtually certain. One has only to wait. Time itself performs miracles. Turn that statement around, though. Without millions of years, evolution does not become improbable. It becomes unthinkable. I had made my shift from evolution to creation before these developments came to light. But if I had had any second thoughts, any buyer's remorse, these events would have dispelled them. If it didn't seem overly dramatic, I'd be saying now, "Here I stand." In any event, I started telling anyone who would listen that evolution is a leaky barge. Before long, I began an apologetics ministry, developing media-rich PowerPoint presentations with special attention to young Christians, whom we all know are at risk. Starting right in my home church, I began taking these to Christian schools, youth groups, and anywhere else that will invite me. Most of them focus on archaeology, history, science, and fulfilled prophecy, but several treat the evidence against Darwinism's worldview. After all, it was he who nearly destroyed my faith, and I don't want to see that experience befall anyone else. Recent converts, as we all know, are the most dangerous. In their zeal, they too often lose perspective. And at age 65, I felt like a new convert. But I like to think that age protected me from that excess. I don't labor under the notion that evolution is a heresy that will doom folks to hell. Countless believers have maintained their faith in Christ and in Darwin, with no apparent discomfort, and I say, God bless them. Evolution is not a salvation issue. Jesus is. Can you believe in evolution and still be a committed Christian? Sure you can. But there is a cost, as I found. Lie down with dogs, and you get up with fleas. So I still carry my deep concern that the atheism lying at the heart of evolutionary theory can eat away at one's faith in Scripture, and ultimately at one's faith in God. If it did that to me, it can do it to others, especially given enough time. You may or may not know the nastiest statistic about Christian youth, that some 2/3 of them will leave the church by their 20s. That's true across the board. liberal, conservative, evangelical, charismatic, Catholic, Protestant. Every Christian leader knows it, and they all lament it. Britt Beamer, a nationally respected market research person, did a study of 1,000 young adults who had been raised in the church but who are no longer active. He found, first, that the common wisdom about them is wrong. It's usually said that they are okay until they graduate from high school. But then some go off to college, and an atheistic professor undermines their faith, and the others enter the workforce and get into bad company and defect. His 70 questions reveal that half of these kids had doubts about their faith in middle school, and the other half in high school. They stayed active in the church so as not to disappoint their parents or youth leaders, but once they could vote with their feet, they did. But long before, they were already gone. The title of the book that Beamer and Ken Ham published about the study. High on these young adults' list of reasons for leaving the church was, they no longer believe the Bible is inspired or historically accurate, especially the early chapters of Genesis. For all too many of them, the call of Darwin drowned out the call of Christ. Many of us know Dan Brown, author of the Da Vinci Code and other novels. Some years ago he was being interviewed for one of those Sunday supplement magazines, and the journalist got round to this question: "Are you religious?" He answered, "I was raised Episcopalian, and I was very religious as a kid. Then, in 8th or 9th grade, I studied astronomy, cosmology, and the origins of the universe. I remember saying to a minister, 'I don't get it. I read a book that said there was an explosion known as the Big Bang, but here it says God created heaven and earth and the animals in 7 days. Which is right?' The response I got was, 'Nice boys don't ask that question.' A light went off, and I said, 'The Bible doesn't make sense. Science makes much more sense to me.' And I just gravitated away from religion. Well, anyone who has read the Da Vinci Code knows how far away he drifted. He became an enemy of Christianity in particular. His book distorts and misrepresents the early history of our faith, with Jesus stripped of his divinity, being the husband of Mary Magdalene and father of a child, and the New Testament being largely a fabrication. Dan Brown didn't just lose his personal faith, as much of a tragedy as that was. He is also taking uncounted numbers of readers with him. And why? Because, as a middle schooler, he asked a serious question and got blown off. Now, of course, that priest he approached may not have had a good answer available. That's not the issue. But the boy deserved to have his question treated seriously. And when it wasn't, what happened? He died. That day, spiritually, he died. Whenever I meet with a group of young believers, I can't help wondering, is there a Dan Brown here? After all, he was just a kid. Nobody knew he would one day be a world-famous novelist. How many like him are out there now, struggling with questions about their faith? They deserve to be treated seriously, and to have access to good answers. And if I can have anything to do with it, they will. That's been my story to date. I don't know whether any part of it may sound like some of your story, because we all have one. Mine led from early, simple faith to doubt and near despair. It had me saying, like that man we read of in the Gospels, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." And finally, he did, bringing me to a faith reborn, with my old doubts lying in shreds. I can't end this talk without asking, where are you? Most of us have heard the incessant drumbeat of evolution and materialism ever since public school, and all of life has been saying we should stick with what's real. Dabble in church if you must, but don't take it too seriously. Don't gamble your bread and butter by chasing moonbeams. Well, I'm here to tell you that moonbeams come from a real moon, and the Bible comes from a real God, and Jesus came to give you a real life and death choice. We are all sinners, and only He can forgive sin, defeat death, and offer eternal life. He did it for me, and can do it for you too. And as good answers go, that's the best one I know. If you have questions or comments about this lecture, or any others in the Good Answers series, you may direct them to me, Dr. Jerry C. 4 at yahoo.com.